Get in, loser. We're gonna go fight a building. The giant boss battle is a cornerstone of game design. Fighting a colossal boss is one of the most reliable ways to make a high spectacle set piece that will stick in the mind of the player. It works in every genre: platforming, RPG, action, puzzle, fighting. Well, it can work in every genre. Designing at this scale is trickier than you think, and if you're not careful, you can cause a lot of collateral damage. Let's talk about the design of colossal boss fights, some games that ran into massive problems, and how different game styles go big. Today's episode is sponsored by GXE from Opera GX. GXE is a platform full of browser games that you can play for free on Opera GX, the first browser for gamers. GXE has all kinds of games, from small experimental ones to larger games made with more resources by more experienced developers. I've been playing a neat little game called Doodle Alive. It's a puzzler where you play as a little doodle that can freely flip between the real world and the paper world to solve puzzles. In the paper world, you can move in a top-down style, while in the real world, you move in a 2D platformer style. It's a clever little game that I highly recommend checking out. Check in week to week on GXE's popular lists. They're getting new games all the time, and you can find some promising new titles you've never heard of before. GXE has weekly game challenges with prizes attached too. The challenges are free to enter, and you could win up to $1,000 in gift cards. Use my link below to head over to GXE, play some games, and win some prizes. Thanks, GXE. The giant boss fight is well-worn territory. Sometimes it's more monster, sometimes more mech. Some fights are a surprise one-off, and some are the game's very core. Some lean into the spectacle, and some the mechanics. There are so many different ways you could go with it that any colossal boss fight is good, right? Final Fantasy XV has a cautionary tale, the Adamantus. One of the game's optional super bosses is against a living turtle mountain. But what's wrong with it, you ask? That looks cool. And you're right, this is cool, but this isn't. Does punching a wall sound fun? No? Then let's take a step back. Why do games have giant boss fights in the first place? Not to sound too obvious, but it's a fun concept. Everyone wants to be David fighting Goliath. Boss fights are supposed to be memorable, unique, spectacular elements of a game. They're a final test of your skill, a narrative crescendo, a harder challenge, and a way to force you to think a little differently about how you've been playing the game up until this point. A giant boss fight checks all of those boxes in a ready-made, super flexible format. But what's so special about a giant boss? It's just big, right? Sure, but we're talking about bosses big enough to impact how a game operates by its mere presence. Colossal bosses throw a wrench into a game's movement mechanics, animation systems, your environmental design, even how the camera in your game works. You can't drop Godzilla 2 into your game and expect everything to just work out. If you want to add in a giant boss, you've got to tailor every aspect of the fight to fit your game's strengths. It usually takes some custom work to make the tweaks to fit a colossal boss into a game. It might involve minor changes, or it might require building new systems from scratch, but not every game does that legwork. The distances involved in giant boss fights can really screw up how character movement feels. Controls that feel good in small spaces might not work over large distances. Breath of the Wild's final boss is Dark Beast Ganon, and the movement in the fight is really dull. Ganon is extremely slow and unfocused on you. Running around hitting basic targets is both mechanically not that interesting, but also dragged out by the long plane distances you have to go through to move around from side to side. Up until this point, Breath of the Wild's movement and traversal had been varied and exciting, with plenty of gliding and climbing mechanics, plus advanced moves like shield surfing if you wanted to. This is just basic horseback riding on flat terrain. There's no mixing in the game's strengths, just the most boring type of movement over the longest time. There's a ton of build-up and ceremony surrounding the fight, and the super basic movement is a letdown. Some colossal bosses don't play nicely with the game's basic combat mechanics. Streets of Rage 4's final boss is split into two phases, a regular 1-on-2 fight, and a 1-on-1 on giant robot spider fight. The spider is a stage-filling stationary robot that attacks you alongside one of the characters. Streets of Rage 4 has a marvelous combo system supporting its basic brawl mechanics. Stuns and combos are a cornerstone of making the fights feel satisfying. but the spider robot can't be stunned or juggled. You're stuck punching a wall with a tiny combo. You can be popped up in the air though. The spider robot turns into something like a stage hazard rather than a one-on-one fight, which was never the game's strong suit. It turns the finale into a tedious pot shot and retreat exercise that barely resembles the rest of the game's combat. Though with the spider boss, you can at least see what's going on. That's not always the case. The scale of colossal bosses can play havoc with how scenes are framed. Melee-focused games can have an especially hard time dealing with this scale. It's tough to fight what you can't see. The Legend of Korra is a character action game that tries to do as much as it can on a tight budget, but it occasionally cuts corners a little too hard. These giant spirit enemies are late-game mini-bosses, and are just upscaled versions of normal enemies, without much accommodation. The game's camera has a very tough time following the action, as it either clips into the boss or gets partially obscured, which makes it tougher to react to telegraphed moves. Legs block your view all the time. While you're fighting, it's often very hard to tell what's even happening. Then the game throws two of them at you at once. No, it turns out that doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so you can't just drop a colossal boss in a usual fight and hope for the best. You've gotta adapt something, somehow. Turning it into the spectacular fight you're dreaming about means emphasizing some parts and de-emphasizing others. But which path you take depends on what you want to focus on. If you're trying to just make a cool set piece with a colossal boss, you could sidestep the mechanics and camera problems entirely. Take the fight out of the player's hands and paper over some of the inherent limitations of colossal bosses with QTEs. Does your main character need to do a flippy dip ultra punch? Just make him tap the Y button and let the game take care of the rest. The camera doesn't behave how you want? Frame the scene however you like. If you're using a colossal boss fight primarily as a spectacle delivery device, QTEs can make your exact dreams come to life. They give the designer complete control over what the player will see. Every camera angle, every punch, every slash can be shown according to your perfect vision with perfect timing. Of course, there are some big trade-offs. Like fun. QTEs sacrifice a lot of interaction. There's nothing else going on for a player to focus on, so you better make sure what you're trying to show off looks good enough to be worth it. You also need to think about what failing a QTE does for your scene. Game over and restart like Dragon's Lair? Or this amazing Spider-Man scene?
Please, someone! I'm going to die!
Do you not allow failing? Would that just be better as a cutscene then? If you do allow failing and continuing, how much extra work do you have to do to show the consequences of missing a timing window? Good QTs are few and far between and can be a little bit of a cop-out, but they're an option if you've got something really cool you want to show off. Some genres can just skip over a lot of the problems that come with the physical presence of a giant boss. Maybe with some fixed camera angles and more abstract mechanics. Sounds like a JRPG to me. Traditional Final Fantasy games have huge sprites compared to the player characters, and you can fight them just fine. Octopath Traveler takes that tradition and cranks up the size and detail even further. These classic style JRPGs can basically do anything they want with the size of an enemy sprite, as the game mechanics are essentially a math problem with some flashy effects. Attacks are abstracted away from the need to really make the animations connect to each other. Like with QTEs, big sprites in JRPGs give the drama of a unique, elaborate enemy with enough flexibility to avoid a lot of design headaches. Colossal bosses might also help make different kinds of gameplay possible. MMORPGs like Final Fantasy XIV rely on giant enemies to help make a 24-on-1 fight work at all. The mechanics of an MMO are expected to be a little more abstract than an action game, so losing the hit reactions is a worthwhile sacrifice for letting a large group of player characters all have a distinct role in a big fight, where everyone fighting smaller enemies would create a chaotic mess of characters with overlapping and obscuring animations. The larger size of MMO bosses let large raids exist as a game format. It's not even an MMO-only concept either. Wonderful 101 and Pikmin are both single-player games that use giant bosses to make their many-on-one fights better. Huge enemies can also be an easy at-a-glance signal about enemy difficulty. In Shin Megami Tensei 5, you enter combat by running into things in the overworld. Scattered throughout are demons that are way out of your league, dozens of levels above what you could realistically defeat. Which enemies are which might have been a trickier thing to signal to a player, but SMT just uses their size to let you know that these guys are trouble. Even their minimap icon is big, so you shouldn't easily get blindsided by a fight. If you're not going to do a QTE, and you actually do want to fight the giant monster yourself, what else can you try? What if you just cut the scope down a little? You don't have to fight the entire monster, do you? Would fighting just part of it work? Just beat up on a leg for a bit. You get the general scope and feel of fighting something massive, but you can abstract away part of it. Streets of Rage 4 tries to do this, and it probably would have worked if not for the severe clash in game mechanics. CrossCode does it a little better. It has a fight with a massive mining robot where you're spending most of your time dodging its massive punches, shockwaves, and projectiles. After this dodging phase, you get a new phase where you can launch bombs at a weak point to stun and attack the robot. The whole fight is mostly framed around the robot's torso and arms, which helps focus the action in a way that keeps the battlefield from getting too crowded. Sometimes though, there's just not enough room to go around. What can you do with a colossal boss that isn't right next to you? Colossal bosses often act like a force of nature, so it can make sense to face them indirectly. Take Bowser's Fury, the add-on mini-campaign built into Super Mario 3D World. Bowser has transformed into Fury Bowser, a raging titan that you'll have to deal with once in a while as you go about collecting coins and cat shines and whatever. Fury Bowser's presence is felt throughout the game, even when he's inactive. His spiky shell egg slowly rises from the center of the lake, spinning faster and faster until the rain starts to fall and the music changes to something ominous. A storm is about to strike. The egg shoots into the sky, flashes, and now you've got Fury Bowser to deal with. Fury Bowser acts like a challenge modifier during normal gameplay, forcing the player to move and adapt and to avoid more obstacles he fires your way. The stages get modified as they're pelted with fireballs and spiky platforms, which you can use to gain more cover and avoid getting hit. These sequences create a more challenging platforming segment full of improvisation, but it's still roughly the same gameplay that 3D Marios are already good at. If you can get your hands on the Giga Cat Bell power-up, it lets Mario stand on equal footing to Fury Bowser and start a more traditional boss fight with a kaiju flair. After scrambling to dodge attacks from an immovable force in the distance, the game provides a great moment of catharsis. Beat him up, he'll retreat, lather, rinse, and repeat until the game's finale. This stage of the fight isn't much different than your standard 3D Mario boss, but the different window dressing makes it stand out. If your game is about fighting at a distance, that can work great too. It really helps one genre that absolutely loves colossal bosses. Shmups involve shooting at targets at range, and keeping distance between you and your target while still fighting them helps make colossal bosses more manageable to fight. Games like Cuphead, Sin and Punishment, and Ikaruga have plenty of bosses that take up half the screen or more, but they don't have to tweak their gameplay much to accommodate them. Their fixed camera and movement style keep these battles from getting too messy or hectic. The larger characters give room for more custom and finely crafted animations that help make these bosses feel like unique and exciting challenges and let you break the fight down into individual parts of the boss to target, which is a nice change of pace from the game's smaller enemies. The custom animations are even practical to help telegraph big attacks that would feel unfair otherwise. The large boss targets also let you not worry as much about precise aiming, so your patterns can become more demanding and fun to dodge. Okay, now let's try flipping it. If you don't want to zoom out to fight the monster at a distance, what if you zoomed way in? What if the boss itself were the environment? A colossal boss can work great as a living level, where navigation and combat can become one and the same. It's perfect for set pieces like the Kronos fight in God of War 3, and it's especially good with games that want to focus on fun, fluid movement and platforming like Solar Ash. Solar Ash flows smoothly between normal level segments and gigantic fights. You parkour your way through destroyed landscapes, working towards several anomalies that eventually unleash the boss. They're levels unto themselves, taking you through tough platforming challenges point to point, finding weak spots to attack as you go. The monster moves throughout, making the terrain shift constantly, forcing you to improvise. Each time you fight one, you'll have to traverse its body several times, taking a different path on each, and each path becomes more and more deadly over time, as its skin becomes like lava and platforms get destroyed. The shifting terrain leaves little room for error and can get frustrating, but it feels exhilarating when you pull off that perfect run. Remember, you're not limited to just one of these techniques either. They can all work together quite well. The opening boss of Metal Gear Rising is Metal Gear Ray, and it has a healthy balance of engaging gameplay and fun spectacle while working around a lot of issues that trip up other games. It's using the same combat system the game already uses without compromises. Movement from point to point still feels good, even with the increased distances. The fight takes place on a city block, where Ray jumps away from you and you have to get in close to hack at its legs. After enough damage, you'll stagger the boss and enter a quick Blade Mode QTE to attack the turrets on its body. Then, repeat the cycle. Ray's attacks are well telegraphed, the camera isn't an issue, and having to run up to Ray helps ground the fight before you start breaking legs. The QTEs end up being little bonuses for successfully beating down the boss, rewarding players with a cool little flourish before you get back to it. The finishing blow is just as cool as you'd hope it would be, and the second fight keeps punctuating gameplay moments with more outlandish action to make the entire fight memorable and satisfying. But if you really want to make this work, you could always design the game from scratch around giant boss fights. Shadow of the Colossus tailors its game mechanics to fit the needs of its 16 climactic encounters. And with nothing much else to do in between them, each mechanic can be balanced solely with its colossi in mind. Every encounter is about manipulating each Colossus' AI in a way that exposes their weakness and allows you to hop onto their body and hang on for dear life while navigating your way to their weak spot. The grip stamina isn't used for a lot of extended climbing sequences, so the designers could make it feel just right for the task. Combat is pretty simple on the Colossus, and without generic enemies to get in the way, it frees up input room for more in-depth puzzle solving, which helps make the game feel even more unique and unforgettable. You know, just make Shadow of the Colossus 2 and you'll be fine. It worked for Solar Ash. Head down to the comments. There are some more unique styles of colossal bosses we didn't mention, but you can help fill in the gaps in the comments. Monster Hunter, the Souls series, and Bayonetta are a few that come to mind, but let us know your favorites, or least favorites. Colossal boss fights become immediate centerpieces in their games, so careful thought can make room for something truly memorable.